Welcome to the Savvy Dentist podcast with Dr. Jesse Green, the show where great dentistry meets great business. Listen in each week as we bring you an inspiring person who will share their story, ideas and business techniques to help you create a practice and a life you love. And now introducing your host, Dr. Jesse Green.
Hi everyone, Jesse Green here. Welcome back to the Savvy Dentist podcast, the show where great dentistry meets great business. My guest today is David Penn, and David is of course incredibly well known in the dental profession, not just as a dentist, but as the founder of Southern Cross Dental Laboratories. David's business interests extend far and wide, and what I've really become super impressed about David is not just his business acumen, but his ability to take something from other professions or other industries and make them relevant and pertinent to the industries that he's working in. It's the not invented here concept, which is actually the premise of this whole podcast. So, David, thank you so much for taking the time to come and hang with us today. I know you're coming to us from your house at the beach today, so thank you for interrupting that and coming to talk to us.
Thanks, Jess. Great to be here.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Thank you.
Oh, like as I said, we're in this pandemic and very tough for so many people around the world at the moment, but we're blessed to be in this wonderful country. You know, everybody has a bit of a whinge at times, but I think we should thank our lucky stars for however we got to this country, our ancestors or otherwise. I think we are all so blessed. So the sky's blue and, you know, compared to some of the places and some of the stories I'm hearing from around the world. Yeah. So great to be here, Jess.
Yeah, mate, we are all very lucky, aren't we? I tell you, I sometimes think that we all won the lotto ending up in Australia, mate. It's probably the best place you could ever be. And, yeah, like you, mate, I'm super grateful.
Yeah, absolutely.
David, you graduated some years ago now, and I remember we were talking the other day on the telephone, and I learned something about you that I didn't quite know, and I knew that when you graduated, you went straight into practice ownership. It must have been a bit of a baptism of fire. Can you tell me how that situation came about? What were the circumstances?
Well, looking back, Jess, if somebody said to me, would you suggest for a new grad at 22 to do that, I would say you're stark raving crazy.
Yeah.
And looking back on it, I did take a risk. But I think the thing is I was akin to swimming on top of the water and not realizing the sharks that were underneath. But yeah, the dentists who have been looking after our family for many years up in the heart of King's Cross, and I'm talking right in the heart of the famous King's Cross then when it was quite colourful. Our family had been going to him and he suggested that when I graduate, because he was getting near the end of his days in practice, suggested that, you know, I come and work with him for a while and then eventually take over the practice. But unfortunately, what happened was we sort of negotiated what I thought at that stage, and I didn't really have any idea what was going on. We set a price, we had it valued. There was an apartment attached to it as well where the practice was. We negotiated a price and we talked about that. Well, maybe this is where it would go at some time. Unfortunately, actually, he was a heavy smoker. He had lung cancer and he died about 10 days before I actually got my results. So the day that I got my results, I was registered. I basically went straight into my own practice. As I said, which looking back on it it was fantastic because it made me, I swim very, very fast.
Yeah.
But looking back on it, would it be something that I would recommend? Maybe not for a new grad these days because the environment is just way, way, way more competitive. But I was lucky, very, very lucky. I had a mentor next door who graduated from Canada who encouraged me and helped me. And the lady who was the practice manager there was remarkable as well. So between the two of them, they guided me through quite an abyss at that stage because clinically I sort of obviously was very inexperienced. I didn't really know a lot. I didn't know anything about the business side of things. Came out very, 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 very raw. But it turned out to be I just had to adapt very, very quickly. Looking back, for me anyway, I think that was one of the greatest lessons. And being actually in that area too, because King's Cross was next to Potts Point, Elizabeth Bay, and some quite upmarket areas as well as all the problem areas in King's Cross and down in Woolloomooloo, et cetera, et cetera. And it taught me just to really be able to relate to a myriad of social structures and cohorts. And I didn't really understand at the time, but looking back, that helped me so much to be able to get on with people and understand people and look at the thousands of shades of grey that were out there.
It's really interesting, actually, mate. I was talking to you the other day about this, but I spent the early part of my career as a dentist in the Navy just down the road at Cuttable. And I always remember thinking that if I'd had a tough day, I'd walk from the fountain to the Coke sign. And by the time I got to the other end, you'd seen, as you say, all sorts of things, all shades of grey. And by the time I got to the other end of the Coke sign, I'd go, you know what, my life's pretty good because there's a lot of people doing it tough. And King's Cross is an eclectic place.
Yeah, well, look, we had, Bob Hawke was just down the road. We had a lot of very, very wealthy people. We had the drug addicts. There was a lot of, obviously, prostitution, and there was a lot of dramas up there back in those days. I actually lived through it all. I was sort of just naive. I used to go down to the famous Cosmopolitan restaurant and sit and have my little salad and bread roll and read my dental journals. And 10 meters away, some of the greatest drug deals in Australia were going on. I mean, it was so naive. But yeah, look, I've visited many, many practices over the years around Australia, when I was teaching and evolving Southern Cross. And I saw a lot of practices which were great, but the cohort was so narrow. And I'm not being critical of that, but it was, let's just sort of say Potts Point was a very, very, Potts Point's really King's Cross. It was a very exciting area, sort of, and you'd never really know what was going to happen each day. So, yeah, very, very grateful for the way that it sort of turned out.
I'm really interested to ask how those experiences set you up for future success, because obviously you've gone on to have incredible commercial success. You've done really well. And you said to me, just then that those shades of grey helped you interact with people and other things. How else did that experience set you up? Was it the baptism of fire and having to sink or swim, and obviously you swam? What was it specifically about that first foray into practice ownership that really set you up?
Well, there was a couple of things. Just the first thing that I noticed was that, again, that each day when I looked at the appointment book, I mean, back in those days, we might have had 4 or 5 emergency visits. Yeah. And that's sort of not something which is, I can't remember in our double bay practice we've got now, when the last time actually somebody walked in pain and said with an abscess or a relief of pain in where we are at the moment is rare. Whereas up there, almost every day you'd be getting a bunch of people who would be walking in. So I guess certainly from those people, that group of patients, you'd have Pacific Islanders, you'd have a whole group of people that I was almost doing I was doing emergency dentistry, relief of pain, a lot of exos, a lot of endos. And then on the other spectrum, I'd have the group who want the high-end aesthetic work, and composite veneers had just started back then, and the ceramics were getting better, and implants weren't around yet. And so I was doing a sort of like a full cross-section of dentistry, on a daily basis. So I think from a clinical skill perspective, it helped me greatly. I realized that there were some areas I was particularly weak, and I could see, certainly with the composite veneers, even back in those days, I could sort of see this as an enormous opportunity there if I could get that right. And that sort of led me to travel to the US. I was very lucky because I was involved with Gordon Christensen and another guy called Ron Goldstein, both remarkable educators. And I spent some time over there with both of them, and I was very well trained, certainly with composite veneers. And I brought that back here, and that was one of the things that sort of got me going. I think the other thing, Jess, I mentioned to you the other day when we had a chat was I realized after about 3 or 4 years in the practice that the scalability of a one-man band, we had 2 chairs, but it was just me, but the scalability of it was challenging. And I could see even as a 25-year-old that the possibility of me, how can I say, growing something significant just out of one place was going to be, when I say significant, I'm sort of saying that not just a small enterprise, but medium to large type sort of business type thing, which, fascinated me. I could see that it just wasn't going to happen if I continued to do the same thing that I was doing. So I think that repetitive nature, I think the fact that I realized that I could only make as much as my hands could produce each day. I think those principles came to me fairly quickly, and I knew that I yearned even at 25. I remember saying to my wife at 25, I can't do this for the rest of my days. And then I think I mentioned I was very fortunate because the guy who was next door to me, a guy called Harry Rich, a really, really lovely man, a very interesting man too. was Viennese, but he'd studied in the US. He showed me, and I think I mentioned this to you, these two catalogs.
Yeah.
And Jess, can I tell you, single-handedly, when I look back on it, there were just a few of those sort of turning moments, serendipitously perhaps, he gave me these two mail order catalogs. One was Henry Schein.
Yeah.
And their greatest competitor was a company called Derby. I don't know if Derby still exists, and I'm assuming that it does. But Henry Schein were a mail order company, a dental company back then mainly. And it was principally US. It really wasn't global yet. And I saw these catalogs and I was just mesmerized. I think that's the only word for it. I was mesmerized that you could have a business around dentistry, which was incredibly scalable, and it was all basically just in a book. And there was no online, there was no internet. I think it was communicated by, telex machines back in those days.
Oh, wow.
Which something you probably, I don't know if you've ever seen a telex machine, Jess, but that was before faxes. And I became really cognizant of that this was such an interesting thing within dentistry. And that's really when the idea for Southern Cross sort of started, purely and simply because I saw what was capable through a mail order. And I thought, well, if we can do that if somebody can do that with dental supplies, why can't we do it with a dental laboratory?
Mm.
And that's really where, as I said, so it was just serendipitous that I was in one place. Somebody showed me a catalog, got the idea. And then what I did was I remember coming home and I got some textbooks about mail order businesses, and I'd come home and I didn't have kids yet, and I'd just sit on the floor at night time and I'd just read all these textbooks about mail order business. So that was sort of very lucky. I guess it was just, if I would have been somewhere else, I might never have come across these catalogs. And so, yeah, that's very, very lucky.
Yeah, look, I'm really curious to dig into that, mate, because I love the idea of taking an idea from somewhere and applying it to something new. And you've done that obviously with mail order. But before we get to that, I want to ask you just really quickly two things. It's a bit of a double barrel question. When you started out your career, did you always know that you wanted to have a medium to large enterprise? And secondarily, what you've been able to do, in my view, is to be able to spot an opportunity, a gap in the market. And again, is that something that you've always innately been able to do, or is that something that you learned to do along the way?
Look, I had an expensive wife. And necessity is the mother of invention. If she listens to this, she's going to kill me.
Oh, dear.
But in all seriousness, I guess, look, I was from a poor family. And I mean, luckily, thanks to Gough Whitlam, university was paid for and I got a scholarship, which was great. I was getting, I had a little bit of money. But yeah, I did yearn for something more, I guess. How can I say, to shake off my lowly born tags, perhaps. I was a kid at school, had holes, and he sort of, I know it sounds funny, but my blazer was always too small for me, this and that. And I was aware that I'd come from sort of difficult circumstances, and I was determined to try and improve myself, whether or not to set up as a large enterprise or not. But I just felt like I always wanted sort of something else. But the second part of the question was, somehow or other, I did feel like, and looking back at it, my mum used to sort of say to me, it was like, well, everybody was doing something. You were always somehow doing something else. Mm. And you could sort of see these things. And I don't know. Didn't have any specific training in this, but she said if I would have a game or something, that somehow I would always reset the rules and just reinvent it. And I guess even now, I'm doing a lot of R&D, which I'm absolutely loving. And I'm really, really enjoying it. In fact, every day now we look at sort of concepts and we try, and some of the inspirations come from the most bizarre areas. In fact, even last night, somebody showed me a device that builders use to when they're cutting stone to get exquisite shapes. And somebody actually showed this to me, and I thought, well, I wonder if we could do that in dentistry. This is just, I guess, little bits and pieces. I don't know where this came from, but I always was interested in sort of looking at things a little bit differently. So the motivation was definitely, from a multitude of sort of sources. But as I said, I think the thing which was interesting is, can you teach somebody that or not?
I don't know.
And at the end of the day, I guess I would have to sort of say probably not. I think a lot of it is innate. I know some people that I employ that book, I think it's called The 10 Faces of Innovation. I don't know if you've ever read that.
I have, yeah.
And it talks a lot about the different type of people you need in organizations. And yeah, I think the inspiration sort of is obviously for new concepts is critical, but you need all those other skill sets too, Jess, which are over the years, and learned that sort of I've got a lot of chunks missing in my repertoire, but I tend to really plug up those gaps with some outstanding people around me.
Yeah.
And I think to be able to recognize that you've got those gaps, Jess, I think is really, really, really important too.
Yeah. Know thyself, right?
Yes. Yeah. Well, it's funny. I think my team sort of say to me that I just create constant chaos every single day. And that the definition of our sort of mission statement is like organized chaos.
Yeah.
And we're running with about 20 different projects at the same time. And my daughter, who's just graduated from engineering school and material science, she's actually probably a more organized version of me, but I can see she's got a very creative element as well. But she's got a whole pile of other skill sets, which I certainly haven't got. So, I think that was one thing, just that I sort of, for any of the younger dentists out there in particular, I remember spending a lot of time in practices that I would sort of see that interpersonal skills sometimes are severely lacking with dentists. And I encourage them to get a gregarious nurse who's got a big mouth, who can talk to everybody and laughs and carries on and who can be the life of the party. And you can get on and just do your clinical stuff. But I think you've got to realize that if you've got two somber characters who sit there not saying much, I think you're going to be struggling pretty badly these days.
Yeah, well, dentistry, above all else, is a people business, and I don't think that's going to change in a hurry. So I agree. Having the ability to talk to people is key. I remember back in the Navy, my whole job when I'd go to sea, interestingly enough, David, my boss was this prosthodontist, Bob, and he used to say to me, Jesse, I don't give a toss how much dentistry you do. Your job is to go and represent us and pave the way for future people to go. So take your pocket full of personality, go out and have a good time, not too good a time, and just get amongst it.
Wow.
And it was really good training. I mean, it was probably a little bit loose. This is back in the 90s. It was a little bit loose. But yeah, what about carte blanche? Go out and just shine and have fun. I thought, geez, okay, sign me up.
I see this all over the world, Jess, that the successful dentists are not necessarily the ones with the best clinical skills. I'm sure you've heard this a million times, but
exactly.
It's the ones with the people skills, where they got, relatively good sort of clinical skills, but outstanding people skills and EQs. And I see this. But again, we talk about sort of how you can transcend from one business to another. Regardless of what you do, it's through every profession, every business. And I'm involved in a plethora of sort of different activities and all sorts of things. And it's the same thing. It's the people skills that at the end of the day, I remember, I think somebody said to me, and I forget who it was, one of the deans of Sydney Uni Dentistry said to me, he thought that the best dentist of all was the ones with an ATAR of usually sort of around between 90 and 95.
Yep.
But with the best people skills. And they sort of said that it was really interesting. So it was sort of like this was over a glass of wine. I won't repeat who the guy's name was, but it was interesting because he said the ones who were sort of like hyper detailed, they would worry about things which were just not clinically significant.
Yeah.
And that would sort of transcend into the way that they would relate to the patients, et cetera, et cetera. So, it's interesting. It's almost like we're sort of educated car mechanics with a great personality. It's going to get you a long way.
Yeah, totally. So I do want to talk about Southern Cross for a second, mate, because I think, this is obviously what you're incredibly well known for, and a bit of it's decades of work, of course, as well. So we spoke about the mail order catalogs, and we spoke about you sitting there devouring textbooks on mail order. What were the early days of Southern Cross like? How did it get off the ground? What challenges did you have to overcome? Was it literally the dorm room story?
Look, I remember it was back in 1982, and so I'd been out, I basically was end of 78, I started the practice, and I've been in there for about 3 years, and I was going nuts because I was just every day was already the same thing.
Bored, yeah.
And I had full books, which are great, and it was, and I thought, well, so gee, it's going to keep on going and going and going. It's sort of like forever. Nothing's really going to change. I'll buy another practice. What's it going to do? I realized from the maths that, that really wasn't going to yield to them much. I think the thing that I was looking for was And I guess, again, this is quite significant as well, is that back in the 80s or late 70s, it was interesting because the cost of high-end ceramics back in those days was prohibitive.
Yeah, okay.
Now, to give you an idea, just back in those days, we used a really wonderful ceramist guy called Luke Rizzo, a guy in Sydney. He was a really, really, he was tempestuous. He was all sorts of things, but he was an incredible ceramist. And he gave us very, very high standards. And if there was ever a prep that wasn't right, he would tell us. But basically the invoice would come back. And I'm talking about just 1980.
Yeah.
I'm talking about a lab bill for for a porcelain fitted gold crown of $250.
Wow.
Now, $250 back then, relative to what we're paying today.
Yeah.
And I know that I probably influenced prices to some extent.
Yeah, I was going to talk about that later, yes. Price setter.
I've still got a few spear marks in my back, but that's another one. But let's just say $250. And I thought, whoa, that was preposterous. Now then, back in those days, we might have been charging $800 for a crown or whatever it was. And that was a lot of money back in those days. I mean, that really went a long way. And I wasn't really cognizant so much of the sort of disproportional fees back in those days. I just accepted it and went along. But I often thought to myself, gee, I wonder what it would be like for the cost of these in other countries. And my father-in-law, God bless him, he died a few years ago. He came from Europe, refugee, came with nothing. He started a business called Manhattan Menswear. And that was, and he built it up to about 20 stores. It was doing very, very nicely. But most of his stuff was coming out of Hong Kong.
Yep.
And he would tell me when I was a young guy, I used to go to the dinner table. I'd be sitting, listening to these stories about Hong Kong. So I remember saying to him one night, well, just out of interest. And I said, why do you go to Hong Kong? He said, well, obviously the cost of manufacturing is much lower. And then I actually said to him, I wonder if it would be worthwhile me going into Hong Kong and seeing what the prosthetics were like being made in Hong Kong. Now, remember, that wasn't part of China. It was still under British rule back then.
Yep.
So things were sort of very, very different. So I think I remember flying up there and arriving, and it was stinking hot, and I knew nobody. And back in those days, how can I say, when an Australian lobs in like a kid, and then nobody would take you seriously. Just the thing that I remember was I visited about 5 or 6 labs with this guy, and the cost of a porcelain fused to gold crown was $9.
Jeez.
Now, I'm thinking to myself, hang on a minute here. You didn't have to be Albert Einstein to realize $256 versus $9. And I looked at the quality and I thought to myself, it's not bad. It's really, really not bad. And the Chinese, of course, have got a great history of working with porcelain, and I mean, fine china by definition is just a ceramic. Anyway, I thought, wow. There's got to be an opportunity. And then I thought, well, how long would it take to get from A to B? Like impressions, there weren't any scans back in those days, of course, and impressions were, I'd get the impression to Sydney. Then I thought, well, let's get that impression up to Hong Kong. Let's get the prosthesis made, send it back, add on my profit margin and see what happens. So that was the idea that I had. And just to be honest, I had no idea really what I was doing, but I just knew the math seemed to be very, very much in my favor. So the part that was perhaps even more fascinating was, how did I get access to a market, to the Australian market?
Well, that's my next question. How did you penetrate the market?
Well, the interesting part was back then there was no CD-ROMs. There was no lists you could get. The ADA put out a list, but that was incomplete. So what we did was, I think there was 57 telephone books of Yellow Pages. Everybody used to advertise in the Yellow Pages. So I employed a girl who basically all she did was enter onto a database on an old computer that we had, the list of every dentist in Australia, name and address basically from the Yellow Pages. So it was purely a manual process, and all of a sudden I had a mailing list of every dentist in Australia. And then the challenge was, of course, what was I going to get out there? How did I get my pricing right? And how did I convince everybody in Australia that all of a sudden they're selling a crown at a certain price, that the quality was going to be reasonable, especially from an unknown region. Remember, that was Hong Kong back in those days. People had very little idea of what was going on. So I dressed it up with what I thought was a great Australian name, Southern Cross.
Southern Cross, yeah.
I thought I couldn't come up with anything more Australian than that. And we sent out the first, I think, can't remember how many it was now. It was in September 1983. We sent out a whole pile of mailers to every dentist in the country, and running it basically out of my mother's sort of second bedroom. I had a little PO box in Bondi, and lo and behold, went back to the PO box about 4 days later, turned the key, and about 20 parcels fell out.
Wow.
And I thought, oh my God, it works. It was like, I was absolutely shocked. Now, just the first offering that they do, or the crowns are costing me $9.
Yeah.
It was probably about $3 or $4 per item as far as freight was concerned.
Mm-hmm.
I decided on the price of $36 per crown. That was just preposterous back in those days. It was almost as ridiculous to sell a crown at 36 as selling it at 250.
Yeah.
It was like, and people wouldn't take me seriously. And I soon realized that, when I say so, it took me a while to realize that there was a sort of this relationship or perceived relationship between price and quality.
Yeah.
And one of the greatest lessons in my life was when somebody said to me, for God's sake, put your prices up.
Yeah.
And then I said, but then I'm ripping people off and this and that and da-da-da-da-da-da-da. And so I learned the hard way with that. But from the beginning, yeah, it was a good concept from the beginning. But just obviously the big problem was, first of all, communication was extremely difficult between here and Hong Kong back in those days.
But logistics must have been tough too, David, surely.
Look, it wasn't too bad because the courier companies were fairly consistent, and the deliveries. And Hong Kong was remarkable back in those days because you could get things in and out of the airport. Like, it was very, very, very efficient.
Yeah, okay.
So we could get things up there in literally about 30 hours, back in 30 hours. And we got even better at that towards the end when we were getting like 1,000 cases coming in a day. We could get them up there, basically in about 14 hours, like door to door. But considering that the flight was, like 8 hours and 45 or whatever it was.
That's phenomenal.
We had it fairly efficient sort of in the end. But yeah, the logistics and keeping track of data was difficult back then. When the fax machines came in, that was a little easier. And of course, as soon as when the internet arrived, that also sort of eventually made a monstrous sort of difference to the way we communicated as well. So it was difficult. I guess the other thing, Jess, the interesting part was that we ventured into mainland China too in about 1982, 1983.
Yeah. And
it had just opened up to the West.
Wow.
And I remember there were machine guns pointed at you. They took your passport. We took a group of dentists into China in about 1986, something like that.
Yeah.
What a remarkable experience that was to see, like a dental hospital in China back then with, very little running water, without any glass in the windows. They'd have all these copy X-ray machines and everything was copied. It was pretty scary to sort of see what was happening to the back then. Sterilization, there was a lot of things. And to see how they've progressed from then to now, I mean, just the story for any young dentist who may be listening is, I implore you, if you can, to go to China, to go to Shenzhen in particular, sort of that's their Silicon Valley, where we sort of spend a lot of time. We operate now. Remarkable people and the ability to be able to re-engineer and to construct, and their work ethic. I owe a lot of my life and success to these amazing people with very loyal, hardworking, and could produce, exceptional products. That's why in the end, just that the local laboratories to compete against us, it was very difficult because we had a product that was, and again, I'm being brutally honest here, good, if not superior to what they were producing at a fraction of the price. And when you get those combinations together, it's, and backed by sort of some fairly broad-based, evidence-based education, which we try to put behind all of our products. And then we had ISO accreditation. It's all of these things we added bit by bit by bit that made it extremely difficult for the local market. And not only in Australia, but we did it obviously in other countries as well. It made it extremely difficult for local manufacturers to compete.
So, David, I really want to ask you, because there's so many threads of this that I'd like to pull and see where we go with it. It's a bit like pulling a thread on a jumper. But you spoke about, getting the market penetration in Australia is essentially building that database, mailing out. But this was clearly not an overnight project. You've been at it for a number of decades now. What was the time frame? I'm curious to ask. It started off as a bit of a back, like a bedroom kind of operation from your mum's place.
Yep.
When did it go from being that to being a full-fledged, business where you think, oh my gosh, we're onto something here. This is now something that I've really got to give some serious consideration and attention to.
That's a really good point. I think there's a couple of very significant turning points. You and I talked about cricket the other night.
We did.
And, I always played a lot of cricket and I loved cricket. And we actually took a group of dentists to Hong Kong University.
Yeah.
And Hong Kong University, probably one of the finest dental schools in the world. And again, it was just serendipitous. I happened to lob into a place where the standard of dental laboratory work in the technical training program was outstanding. But we organized a set of lectures for these Australian dentists to attend. And one of the guys who walked in was a Yorkshireman.
Yep.
And the Yorkshireman on the first slide that he showed was an absolutely beautiful shot of Jeffrey Boycott. I don't know if you remember Jeffrey Boycott.
We're the most famous Yorkshire batsman ever. Absolutely.
Well, Jeff Boycott actually ended up working for my uncle. A long sort of story, as a tailor. But it was an image of Jeff Boycott driving through the covers and the ball had just hit the bat.
Mm.
And this Yorkshireman, a guy called Phil Newsom, great guy, a dentist who was at a HKU then, he was also a brilliant photographer and actually ended up being a Formula One photographer, which is another story. But he had this beautiful image and I thought, my God, this is really interesting. So that piqued my interest and I got talking to Phil about Jeff Boycott. I said, well, where did you get this from? And he said, well, I'm from Leeds. I said, no way. I said, I'm a Leeds supporter, right? Anyway, we hit it off immediately. But the reason why this is very relevant is because then he introduced me to the head of dental technology at Hong Kong University.
Uh-huh.
And the guy who was there who's now, this is listed on the stock exchange now. It's a monstrous company worth billions. This is called Modern Dental.
Yep.
The Southern Cross is part of that now. We got together and we started talking and I said, well, look, I've got a laboratory in Australia and I'm doing this and I'm doing that. And I said, I'm outsourcing to China. And he said, well, actually, I've got a little laboratory that I'm working on. So we started talking and we were backwards and forwards for a couple of years. And again, it was just fortuitous that when the change came in 1997, I was looking for, to try and cement up a relationship with a better laboratory. Godfrey Nye, his name was looking for overseas distributors. And we said, well, okay, let's try and do some work together.
Mm-hmm.
Now, from that moment on, we hit it off really well. And it was just almost like the perfect marriage. I had a brilliant partner who could produce a high quality prosthesis, not only crown and bridge, but removable stuff, but he could produce high quality stuff under great control. And we had the ability to be able to access the markets here. So it's almost, we had this vertically integrated model that sort of blossomed and the prices were good. The quality was exceptional. I helped a lot in communication and being able to track because they weren't particularly good at controlling mass data, but I helped a lot with that. So I guess just the turning point came then. It was once we got that relationship right. It was around about the time of the Olympics in Sydney.
Mm-hmm.
I would sort of say that's when we really nailed the model. And well, the rest in the next 15 years, it just grew. We're already in New Zealand and then we're in the US and then we're in Ireland and then we're in the UK. And we started to grow exponentially because the product really resonated and the marketing really resonated. Again, it was education to the base. So I think that was a massive turning point, was meeting this particular guy. And between the two of us, he had a hunch and he had something, I had something, and the old Stephen Johnson thing about two hunches coming together and forming something which is greater. I think that was very much the turning point. So that was really about 2000. I think the other major one, which I have to sort of say made a monstrous difference, just with the obviously connecting up with Align Technology and getting involved with Invisalign in the early days. And I have to thank Mark Van Wield and Harry Margett for that, because they came to me and they said, well, you obviously got a very dominant place in the marketplace. We would like to introduce clear aligner therapy to the general dentists. And I took a bit of a punt with that and educated myself, but I was well trained with that. And well, the rest of the next, and then of course, adding an incredible brand name to a product, to something we had already, it was like just adding kerosene onto the fire. And then all of a sudden it just went absolutely crazy. So I think that was that opened up a whole pile of opportunities for us. And then I guess the third major thing would have been when the government had the scheme, the $3,000 or the $4,000. I mean, my God, that was, if you just had a ingrown toenail, you could get $3,000 to get your teeth fixed. And I must admit, that really fueled demand like it was insane. Yeah. So I think that they were three things. I look back on it: the meeting at Hong Kong Uni and meeting with them. That was major. Obviously, the Align Tech thing that sort of grew into something which was very, very major, and the government sort of. Those three things in particular. I sort of looking back, I'd sort of say that there were three turning points. Which we went from a backyard operation to a small operation, then to medium size, and then we grew rapidly. That was probably one of the hardest things of all, was managing the growth. Okay,
so that's a really good entry point for me. So just a quick thing there, David. So what I'm understanding is if you started Southern Cross since, let's call it 82 or 83 thereabouts, it was a good 15, 16 years before you really hit the J curve.
Absolutely.
And took off, right? And so I want to talk about managing growth in a second because that's going to be really fundamental. But what I want to ask you is what those 15 or 16 years were like, because did you always know it was going to take off, or was it giving you enough to encourage you? Were there moments of doubt? What challenges did you come up with? Where did you stuff it up along the way, basically?
Oh, well look, I get the school of hard knocks.
Yeah, totally. So, but I'm curious because that's a long period of time, right, to maintain enthusiasm.
It was because, but look, it provided a solid income from the beginning. So there was very, very, I was making almost as much from almost immediately as I was from my dental practice.
Right.
So all of a sudden I started thinking to myself, well, do you really want to be 5.5 days a week in the practice? I used to race up to cricket on Saturdays after work in the morning, and basically I had one day off, and the rest is I was working really hard. Then I thought, well, actually the lab's getting bigger. So what about if I work 4 days in the practice and I spend a day in the lab?
Yep.
And then basically it took a long time before I would let go of my cash cow, which was the practice. So I think I was cautious, and I had to be protective of the limited income, or what income that I did have. And so I had to be cautious. And that sort of definitely sort of put brakes on the growth. No doubt about that. Did I always know it was going to be successful? No, I didn't. Yeah. Did I have any idea that it could have gone as large as it did? Absolutely not. I'd be lying if I even contemplating, how it actually ended up. But I did think to myself that over a period of time, I mean, I had to break through an incredible barrier, Jess, it took me a long time to get. I had to convince the Australian marketplace that a Chinese product was commensurate with the quality, in Australia. And
I remember that.
Well, first of all, I had the local technicians obviously were up in arms.
Of course.
And that was an issue. And I mean, that got very vicious, at one stage. I mean, there was, they made up all sorts of stories about lead in the crowns, and I mean, some crazy stuff. And then we had SARS, and we had avian bird flu, and we had all sorts of other sort of things which were out of our control. But I could see it was, even back in those 15, 16 years, it was growing, and it kept on growing, and the signs were positive. So I never really lost hope that it wasn't going to grow. But how can I say, I never anticipated that it was going to grow as large as it did. But there were so many challenges, Jess. I mean, it was like there was time, there was finance. I was fiercely independent. I didn't want to go attract any other investors or have any partners. Maybe today some people who would be in a lot more of a rush, they might have gone out and said, well, let's raise some money, let's get some partners, let's get some experts in here, let's try and accelerate that. But looking back, the way that it transpired, the learning curve and that slow drip of trying to sort of say to everybody, look, have a free crown, try it out for yourself, and if it's pathetic, you tell me. And I knew that once they tried it, that it was very hard to turn back. Once you've got a crown, which is, like a third of the price and just as good, if not better, it's hard to turn your nose up at that.
Totally. Mate, I remember all those days when Southern Cross was really just, I hate to use the pun, cutting its teeth, but when the market penetration was starting to come, and there was a point where it became you couldn't ignore it. It became such a thing that you had to look at it. And I remember all of the people I knew saying, we've got to look at this, and it's a really fascinating story. I'm curious to ask about the J curve, mate, because when that rapid growth came, rapid growth can actually, in some businesses, lead to their ultimate failure, but you obviously managed it very well. Were you ready for the growth when it came? Or did you anticipate the growth, and how did you get through it?
The interesting part was just that the growth was, there were a number of sort of things. So there was probably about three things which, looking back on it, were interesting. And a lot of this again can transcend into dental practice. I was talking to some Canadian American dentists about an hour ago, actually, just talking about this type of thing and how these people were reworking their systems to try and make them to make optimal productivity, let's just sort of say.
Yep.
And certainly post-COVID, or not post-COVID, I should say mid-COVID, they were looking at ways and means of optimizing the operatories in terms of sterilization of this. And so they're adapting all the time. We basically had to do the sort of same thing. When you had all of a sudden 50 cases coming in a day, you needed a small team. And I did most of the marketing myself, but we had a small team in logistics. The interesting part was then that as that grew, first of all, we had to get premises that were larger. And that in itself, because I was in Double Bay and I didn't want to move out of Double Bay because I had my clinic there and I was close to home. And so we outgrew our first place. And then we basically moved into a building where there were 3 floors. And before we knew it, that building was full.
Oh, wow.
But the scary part, Jess, the growth was so rapid that as we designed and what we thought we were building in significant excess capacity, that excess capacity would almost be taken up before we'd move into our new premises. Now, that in itself showed it was bizarre. Like we thought, okay, now we've got 50 cases a day. Let's imagine if we got 100 cases a day. And we thought, how many people will we need? How many booths will we need to put each impression, each color, each this, and all sort of instructions, et cetera, et cetera. So that was a huge challenge in itself. In the end, we had 3 buildings in Double Bay. We had underground tunnels. It was just the poor guy at Double Bay Post Office. He laughed. He said, David, you got to move out of here. He said, because you're clogging up my post office. He said, half of the business coming to this post office is you. He said, every morning we get this truckload of parcels. He said, our post office in Double Bay is full of your stuff, right? So we actually got a guy who I'd played football with. He would actually he would get to the Double Bay post office at 7:00 and he would empty out everything out of Double Bay post office and put it in his truck and take it to us early so that Double Bay post office could actually survive, because
that's hilarious.
It was a really, really funny story. I think the other thing, Jess, which is interesting too, and this again, this is very much related to dental practice as well, because the Chinese government were watching everything that we were doing. And I'm not saying there certainly wasn't a problem, and they were very kind to us, but we knew, we were aware that they were watching our data.
Mm-hmm.
And what actually happened was that we were getting miscommunication between one place and another. And this can happen obviously in all forms of dentistry. Purely and simply, like Jess comes in, needs a crown on his 1-1. I take the shade as A2, and then we write it on the lab form, send it to the laboratory. But then we get you back for something else, and then we look at it again. We say, no, it's actually an A1 or a B2 or whatever.
Yep.
So we had to get that information up into China, up into Hong Kong and China, and we had to get that. And we would actually send emails, and then the crown would come back, and it was come back as an A1.
Right.
And all of a sudden, we were getting about 7 or 8% failure rate because of lack of communication. And what we realized was that a lot of these emails had been intercepted, not necessarily harmfully, but that somebody had been watching it, and we were losing data between here and China. And now this happens in all forms, every part of dental practice as well. I mean, communication, writing down everything on your computer, obviously detailed, but more details, the better. So that was a monstrous problem, because all of a sudden we're getting hundreds and hundreds of cases from around the world coming every day, losing more and more data, and we didn't know how to get around it. So that was really potentially a potential headwind for us. But I got this idea of back then of writing a tracking system.
Mm-hmm.
It was a web-based tracking. We're talking about 2003.
Yeah.
And we actually did, and I color coded it. So what would actually happen is that when that color change would occur, the Chinese technician would have to press a button to change the color in that particular field to actually acknowledge the fact that last bit of correspondence had been received and had been actioned.
Wow.
So without those color changes, we knew that there was a problem with the communication. So we actually employed dentists then who would read all the instructions every single day of every order, and we would be dealing what was called the reds. So the things in the red zone were the ones where we were concerned that there wasn't a communication or there was a miscommunication.
Mm-hmm.
And without that system, and that system is still running today, it's been improved a lot, obviously, but I know the laboratory is still using that 17 years later, and that allowed us then to control a massive amount of data from all the laboratories around the world. So at any one time, I could look at my computer and I could see every single case around the world, and I could see the problem cases, and I knew almost at the end of the day how many crowns we'd made, et cetera, what was going on. So that in itself gave me the opportunity to be able to manage monstrous growth, because we had that system which turned out to be a godsend. Without that, and now a lot of the big companies have, and most dental practices have similar types of things where you can manage massive amounts of data, very, very effectively. So that in itself allowed me to transcend a lot of those speed bumps through growth. The problem in the end, though, Jess, was as it grew, and when I decided it was time to get out, was because it was getting so large that I was dealing a lot with HR issues.
Mm-hmm.
And even though I had HR issues, and this is something in dental practices
happens all the time.
It does. And it's so counterproductive. And I know that practices that go from, 3-4 people, usually they can manage it. But once they start getting up to 7 or 8 people, all of a sudden you start to give the argy-bargy, and boy, that can ruin a practice. And I've seen that happen time and time and time again. And no doubt in Southern Cross, we had a lot of divisions, but managing the HR in the end became, I was probably spending 40% of my time managing HR around the world.
That's huge.
And that's not good.
That is it. So let's change gear and talk about practice specifically for a moment. When we were talking the other day, we were talking about the state of the profession, oversupply and all the rest of it. And we were talking about the DMF numbers that you'd see in the 70s when you started versus the DMF numbers that you'd see now. And of course, the number of patients per dentist as a ratio there. Can you walk me through your experience? You've been a dentist a bit longer than me, but what were those numbers like when you first started compared to now?
Yeah, well, I remember, Jess, that there was only 5 dental schools back then, and I think there was about 400 new grads a year. And I remember looking at the numbers, and I believe the ratio was about 3,000 to 1. So 3,000 patients per dentist. On an even spread, that's what you get. And with the DMFT of back then, I would say, and I have read some evidence about this, it was about 12. Wow. So here I was in Potts Point and King's Cross. I've got 3,000 patients with 12 surfaces that needed had been filled or decayed or missing, et cetera, et cetera. So I've got 36,000 surfaces, which ostensibly I could work on. Today, I think it's down to about 800. And the DMFT is something like 3 or something like that. So instead of 36,000, obviously now it's, 800 times 3 is 2,400. Now, if you look at that in any other business realm, somebody asked me, would you go into a business that's contracted? And I'm just not talking about supply. I'm just talking about demand at first. Obviously supply is affected because supply affects it because if you've got less dentists, and even though you've got less demand, but what should have happened was that the supply should have gone down. They should have restricted the number of people either entering the country who are dentists or the number of dental schools. So it's just what I've sort of seen is what I call it dental Armageddon. You've got you've got this perfect storm where you've got demand has decreased significantly and supply has gone up. So you've got more dentists actually with less demand. So, you've got the perfect storm here. Look, I know it sounds terrible, but in some countries where there's no fluoridation, obviously the problem is nowhere near as bad. And I know you've got areas in Australia like that, but I talk to people in other countries and they say, well, we haven't got such a problem because there's still a lot of rampant caries around.
Yeah.
Whereas I know in Sydney, if you get, and probably the same in Canberra, you get a 30-year-old come in and you get them approaching, they mightn't be cleaning their teeth so well, et cetera, et cetera. If you happen to talk them into even sort of just from an examination, some bite wings, and look at their teeth, how many restorations are you likely to find now on a 30-year-old?
Yeah, not that many, mate.
Not that many. So what are you doing? You're cleaning their teeth, maybe putting a bit of fluoride, maybe, and then you're walking out and say, well, come and see us in 6 months. And the patient think, well, hang on, my teeth are really good. I don't really need to go in 6 months. I'm going to go once a year. So you've got people with better teeth that are saying, I don't need to go off as often as we used to be recommended. So it's almost like self-perpetuating. You've got people with better teeth coming in less and less and less. So, and the procedures you're doing on these patients, let's just sort of say, well, there's so many no gap type practices and insurance only and rebate only and all that stuff now. Is that a money-making enterprise? Is that going to pay for your mortgage and stuff? Gee,
it's pretty tough, isn't it?
No, it's very, very tough and so much more competition. So, Jess, I think we talked about this before. I mean, I'm quite passionate about this. I feel very sorry for a lot of the younger dentists who have been placed in this hyper-competitive environment and where the pure economics, and if you study economics, I did an MBA back in 2007. I saw this, clear as daylight. And I think I remember about 3 years ago, and I won't mention the name, but it was the head of one of the heads of our regulatory bodies who represent a significant number of dentists. A female said, and I quote, she said, well, the laws of economics don't apply to dentistry.
Since when?
And I know who this person is, and she made this statement about 3 or 4 years ago, and that was a pretty scary remark. And the implications, and we've talked about this before, the implications for the younger dentists, and I'm not sort of saying it's terrible for everybody because there's going to be a lot of people around who'll still do very well, but I think for the general cohort, that bottom 25, 30%, I think there's going to be a lot of unemployed dentists or partially employed dentists
I agree.
or underemployed. And I feel very sad about that because I think it's a regulatory decision made by an Australian authority back in I think about 2004, 2005, who opened the floodgates for so many more dentists to come in and more dental schools. And I just think the basic premise and when you look at sort of read the conclusions they made, a lot of them were very, poorly thought through. And the implications for our profession going forward are heinous. That's the only word that I could use for it.
Well, again, we had a talk the other day about using evidence to make decisions in business as much as in dentistry, and we'll come to that in a bit more detail in a second. But I guess for the younger dentists listening to this podcast, David, what would be your thoughts around having a career in dentistry? What remedial action could they take, should they take to ensure some sort of longevity or indeed some other sort of venture?
Yeah, well, Jess, this is something that I can't tell you how many dentists come to me and ask me questions like this. And it's such an interesting one. I think there's two things to consider here, Jess, in particular. I think number one is lifespans in general have just increased so dramatically. When I graduated, I remember thinking, well, I'll work to 50, 55, and I'll probably drop dead, when I'm 70 or 72 or sort of something. And so, I'll have 10 years in retirement and whatever happens, happens. Let's just sort of say, obviously, with life expectancy now, I would sort of say for us, certainly in the mid-80s now, and, to be able to fund a reasonable lifestyle in the last 10, 15 years of your life, perhaps, when you're likely to need some finance to be able to keep yourself into that from a health perspective. I'm not sort of saying you're going on these massive trips or buy yourself a Ferrari every year, but to keep a reasonable lifestyle, you're going to have probably by the time, if you're going to live to 85, you've got to think, well, okay, I'm probably going to have to work till I'm 70 or 75 to be able to support those last 10 years. And I don't know if too many people want to be a dentist really past the age of sort of 65. And I don't think that many patients really want to see dentists who are really older than that anyway. So I sort of think you've got this conundrum where you've got to think, well, as a 25-year-old new grad, how long am I going to have to work in this profession for, number one? And the maths just tell you, you're probably going to have to work for 50 years.
Yeah.
Now, 50 years is a long time doing the same thing, number one.
Musculoskeletally too, you know.
Yeah, well, it's when you think about your back, your eyes, and all the dramas, from leaning over patients, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So you've got to be able to squirrel away enough money to be able to support yourself in your older age. That's number one. So I've given a number of talks about this idea of having an additional string to your bow. You've really got to go out there and reorganize another form of, if possible, passive income.
Mm-hmm.
And you've got to have an additional skill set, I think, from as young as you possibly can. Now, that takes some planning because you sort of think, okay, I'm 25 and I've just gone through all these years in dental school, and some old dude's telling me, hang on a minute here, you're going to be struggling. Is this guy crazy? But I think a lot of dentists tend to hit the wall 40, 45, 48. They realize, oh my God, this is boring. I can't do this forever. And they get a bit of a panic and they start to see the maths looking not as encouraging for maybe that retirement period.
Mm-hmm.
And so I really would encourage every dentist where they possibly could to sort of add an additional set of skills, whatever it is. And it doesn't have to be within dentistry. It can be in a plethora of areas. I just think it's a good idea to open your eyes and say, look, wouldn't it be nice to work as a dentist 3 days a week or 2 days a week and enjoy my dentistry and do some nice stuff and have a solid little cash cow there, but look at the possibility of doing something else.
Mm.
Now, the first question I always get is, well, what do I know what to do? Because I've only been trained to do blah, 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 blah.
Yeah.
So you've got to be pragmatic enough and introspective, I believe, to sort of say, okay, let's start again and go and do this and go and do this or go and do or whatever it is. It doesn't really matter. I just think that it's just so important now for dentists, younger dentists, to have a multitude of skills. And if possible, to be able to say, okay, there's something else that I can do, whether you want to be a property investor, whether you want to be in the tech game, whether it doesn't really matter. Go and help your wife in her business, do this and do that. To me, the writing is on the wall. Don't get me wrong. There'll be plenty of people who can do okay just from dentistry. In the way that I sort of see it, I think the way things are heading, I think it's going to be very difficult for young dentists to be able to have a career which is totally enjoyable, which is lifelong, and which is going to provide enough income that's going to be able to set them up, that they really, the way that perhaps the younger dentists think that, that it was going to be.
Yeah, mate, I'm in agreement with you 100%. I'm curious to ask you about opportunities and business models. And I know we've kind of going off into the weeds a little bit here, but do you see dentistry with the model you had with Southern Cross, where you became a price setter and you disrupted the prices and you were able to challenge the norms? Do you see that dentistry is going to become much more price sensitive? Do you think there'll still be a place for a boutique practice? If you were going to stay in practice, what sort of practice would you have?
Well, I guess it suits the individual. If I talk to my friend Alex Abrahams, he'll tell you that he'll love to run a practice for 57 minutes of the hour productively, and he will show you that a volume type dentistry can work.
Yep.
If it's really controlled well. And I see this, we work with a company, one of the largest corporates in the world in the US called Aspen Dental.
Mm-hmm.
We work with them and they run a very, very, very tight ship. But I think, Jess, with your Navy experience, it's almost like, and Daryl, a similar background, Daryl Holmes.
Yeah.
I think you need to be able to run it almost with military precision.
Yeah.
And you've got to take the people out of the game, and it becomes very much, I'm not saying a widget game, but it very much is a volume-based productivity, optimization, which there's some people who can run that really, really, really well. I don't know how well suited it is for a lot of certainly female-centric practice now. I don't know, and I'm not saying that a female can't run a large corporate, because that's equally as preposterous. But given the fact that they may have an interlude by having kids, they're happy to sort of be a mum and a dentist and work for 2 or 3 days a week. It makes it a lot harder for them to obviously run, to scale up a large scale sort of corporate.
Mm.
So I guess I can sort of see, Michael Porter from Harvard, talks about, competitive advantage. And there's two things: you can either compete on price or you compete on basically being unique.
Yes.
And on quality. And look, my nature is very much one where I compete. I'm looking for something called long-term sustainable competitive advantage.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to be either offering things that nobody else does, or I want to be able to offer things which are better than everybody else does. That's me by nature. And in everything that we try and do in our R&D team, and we work with New South Wales Uni and a whole bunch of people now to produce some really neat products. I'm sort of saying, I want to be where nobody else is.
Mm.
So I guess it comes back to your nature. It also comes back to risk profile.
Mm-hmm.
I personally think there's a lot less risk when you try and set up something which is unique.
Mm-hmm.
We use something called the Vryo test,
mm-hmm.
which I was taught in MBA school as a test to basically sort of say, do you have a sustainable competitive advantage? And one of the games I always play in any mentoring groups that I'm involved with, I sort of say, tell me something that you can do, Jess, that nobody else in the room can do as a dentist.
Yeah.
What have you got that's special about you? And it's really interesting because most of them haven't been confronted by a question like that before. And they said, well, I'm really gentle. And I said, yeah, but hang on, Jess. Everybody else in the room are going to say they're gentle. What do you got that's unique?
Yep.
I'm a nice guy. Well, everybody else purports to be a nice guy or girl as well. What have you got that's absolutely unique?
Mm.
And it's not until you start being really confronted with something like that you stop and think to yourself, well, hang on a minute. I've really actually got nothing that separates me from the guy down the road. The moment he starts to, well, I'm cheaper, the moment he says that, well, it means you're not as good.
Yeah.
And then I said, well, do you want to fall into that? No, I don't want to be like that. So once people sort of get in your face a bit and start asking these uncomfortable questions, then I think it allows you sort of to position yourself. And I encourage dentists, where possible, if they've got the nature for it, to try, as I said, I'm with Michael Porter's, two concepts here. You can't be the cheapest and you can't be the best.
No.
But I try and encourage, and maybe this is just my nature, but I try and encourage everybody to be the best. And you look at unique things and try and get into, systemic oral medicine, to get into salivary diagnostics, to get into clear aligners. That's becoming more of a commodity now, as you know. But trying to get people into areas of dentistry which we weren't before, because the frontier land is almost gone. It's almost, we've almost reached Hawaii, and it's like, for the Americans, that's the end of the world. And, I think it's getting the same with dentistry. We're getting to the age, well, what else can we possibly do? So, yeah, that's the way that I feel that if I were going to do this and if I had to do it again, I would do exactly the same thing. I'd be setting myself apart from everybody else. I wouldn't want to be in a race to the bottom and competing on price, because that is a very, very, and as you said with Southern Cross, same thing. I mean, the local technicians basically had set themselves up for a fall because they left such an incredible gap between $0 and $250.
Yep.
I had a lot of maneuvering room, to be able to be very, very competitive. And I think the same thing with dental practice. It's like, if you come in with a normal product, or you can offer something that nobody else has got, I think you're going to do just fine.
Well, there's a lot more price elasticity in that space, isn't there? I mean, you can move your pricing around when you've got that uniqueness that you speak about. So I think that's really interesting.
Well, what I like is that where you can have a conversation with the patient and the price isn't even discussed.
It's immaterial. Yeah. Then
you've got something which is so unique. Then I think you're playing a different sport, and that's hard to find in any business. I mean, we talk about this in everything that we do in all the different type of businesses I'm in, but we try to be different all the time. But to find that is a needle in the haystack, and a lot of people haven't been trained or even to think like that, or even to be able to go and look for it. So it's very perplexing for a lot of people.
Yes, it's that whole blue ocean strategy stuff, isn't it? You're trying to create that category of one, and it's tough. It's really tough.
Well, it's getting tougher because I certainly think with the internet that if Jess lives in Chicago and I'm living in Canberra, and all of a sudden Jess thinks, hey, I've got a great idea about some sort of facial aesthetic product, and you put it up on the web, and then I do a search and I find you, and guess what happens? All of a sudden that geographic advantage that we had by being in different countries 20 years ago, that's gone.
Yep.
Because I can see what you're doing in 5 minutes. So guess what? I'm going to copy this, blah, blah. I'm going to send it to my guys in China. They're going to do such and such and such. And in 3 or 4 weeks, I got rapid prototyping of something that you did. And so what's happened to the chronology of your competitive advantage?
Yeah.
It's gone in no time. So it's not only the idea of one, but it's the idea of having one that's why it's competitive advantage is great, but sustainable competitive advantage in this day and age, I think it's
tough.
Really hard to find.
Yeah. Now, mate, just really quickly, I've got a couple of last little things I want to talk to you about. Your lovely wife, and her family started off with Manhattan Menswear, which has morphed into Lowe's.
Yep.
And you mentioned to me on the phone the other day that she's an incredibly bright and accomplished woman. And
she is.
And I would love to know, if she was going to give any advice to dentists, what do you think dentists would learn best from her?
Well, poor thing, she's been terrorized by me for 40 years.
I know.
So she probably, don't marry a dentist.
Too late. I've already done that, mate. I've done that.
Yeah, she's been an incredible support and an incredible sounding board. She's a shrewd woman. She was a lawyer, a great lawyer, but she went into business with her dad. I think the lesson that she would teach would be, and what her strength is, that she tends to simplify things to a level of efficiency. And they're doing this in Lowe's at the moment. And she's doing a remarkable job. They've got 195 stores around Australia. And I think her ability to be able to problem solve, but in a way where we're not bringing in massive amounts of complexity, because I think as dentists, we're trained to look at the minutiae. We're looking at margins. We're looking at this. We're looking at, moving teeth, like, 0.125 of a millimeter every week, and some crazy sort of minutiae. She is particularly good at overseeing things and saying, well, look, from a procedural point of view, if it was to simplify things, whereas, we go along to a course on, I don't know, bonding composites or something, and we're taught to do this and this and this and this and this and this. And I'm not saying that to take steps out of the process, but I think efficiency is something that I noticed that she is particularly good at. Mm-hmm. I know that with her, I sort of help her a little bit in, my title at Lowe's is called I'm the Chief Disruption Officer, because I tend to come along and add complexity and look at things from a strategic point of view, maybe from above. And that's good, but I tend to add complexity. And I think as dentists, we tend to do that. Whereas from her strength is very much of getting to the nitty gritty and really delivering on something which is, the Lowe's product is phenomenal value for money. And, in this pandemic, there's a flight towards this type of value for money proposition. So I think, she's in particular, I get her to look at a lot of things that we do. And she just said to me, it's too complicated. It's too this, it's too that. Just pare it back to a form that everybody's going to be able to use easily. And she's taught me a lot in that regard. So, I think that would be the best, probably the most prominent lesson that I could learn from her. And the young dentists is the same thing.
Yeah, all right. One last question, mate, because you've been incredibly generous with your time today, mate. We've been talking for a good hour and a half, and I'm so grateful. But we did talk about Eastern Suburbs Footy Club as being your club of choice.
Absolutely.
And you pointed me to the 1975 grand final against St George, and we were talking just before we got recording that Graham Langland's had a shocker that day because he had a needle.
Yeah. What
is it about East that you love so much, apart from the fact that they're your local side, but what is it about the club that you like and admire?
Well, look, I guess just purely and simply, I was born and bred in the Eastern Suburbs. My dad went to Bondi Beach Public School. He was born in 1925. And from a very young age, he was passionate about the Roosters, took me out there. And I remember in 1966, and this is a long time, I was only a kid, but we went through the whole season. We didn't win one game.
Oh, wow.
And the Roosters were broke, and the Lees Club was in a pub up in Bondi Junction.
Yep.
And the club was, I'm not saying defunct, but it was pretty close to it. And then Kerry Packer got involved and the whole sort of things changed, of course. But I just think, it's like whether the passion for the Broncos or for Canberra, it's sort of somehow it gets into your DNA. And, I used to go to the grounds and I saw a lot, there was just something about, how can I say, the ethos in the club. I thought it was well run. Once Packer got in there, obviously the, City Forward were, involved. There's no such thing as a salary cap with the Roosters, of course. But
that is so true.
My friends call it the sombrero. The Roosters have got a sombrero. We have a laugh. But look, Jess, I think that passion in sport and, I follow this crazy team in England in the second division, the AFL called Leeds United. And again, it's the same sort of thing. I can't tell you where the passion came. I know how I got it mixed up with a club, et cetera, but I think I get incredible joy out of just supporting a bunch of crazy people running around after a bit of plastic, a ball. I just think it's, to try and explain how why you love the club so much. I just think it's almost like inbuilt from when you're a kid. And, I love it. I must admit, if you see me on 1 o'clock, normally without this pandemic, I'm up watching this Leeds team. And my wife said, don't come near me because I'm so nervous watching this game of soccer. And I mean, it's totally irrational. It just makes no sense whatsoever. But I love it. And, when I go to the UK and I go to games and I'm sitting amongst these crazy people who that's all they live for, Jess. Yeah. And it's just amazing. I mean, you've seen this. I'm sure you've seen it with football in Australia, but over there it's times 10.
Yeah.
And they love it and they talk about it and they go out for a drink afterwards and they're prepared to fight against the other supporters. And oh my God, it's something else. So I guess it just makes you stop and think about the frivolity of life in a way. It's like, here we are. We try to do the best in our profession. We try and do everything as well as we can. I always finish off a lot of my lectures when talking about clear aligners. And I said, look, it's interesting that we look at all the problems in the world now. And here we are. I've just spent like 2 hours in a lecture room with people talking about how to move 1 tooth.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
An eighth of a millimeter. It's like when you look at it in the whole realm of things, it's ridiculous that here we are. We're sweating over whether we can move a tooth an eighth of a millimeter in 1 week or 2 weeks.
Yep.
And I think it helps put things into perspective. And I guess that's like with my soccer and my cricket and all the things that I love. It's the same sort of thing. It just puts things in perspective somehow, and makes us very lucky that, again, just to come back to where we started, that what lucky people we are to end up in this amazing country. And we've all had good lives. And, I think we should be just all so grateful. And as Michael Hutchence would say, we should be kissing the dirt.
Oh, mate, absolutely. Now, there's a good dude. Big fan of In Excess. Hey, David, look, mate, we have covered a lot of territory today. We've kind of been uphill and down dale. Is there anything you want to leave the audience with before we wrap up?
Yeah, look, I guess the only sort of thing that I would sort of say, this is really, again, coming back to the young dentists. And I'm an old dude now and I've been around the traps for a long time. The greatest example I can give to where I sort of think as far as dentistry is concerned is I look at my daughter, and at one stage she was considering becoming a dentist. I discouraged her and I said to her, I think maybe an engineering degree or something like that would be a good idea. So she did a degree, as I said, in material science. She also did physics and maths majors, but she also did at the same time a degree in manufacturing and mechanical engineering. She's 6 years and now she's working with me as a lead engineer, which is just phenomenal. I think the interesting thing to learn from that is, though, that she has the ability to be able to go into so many different projects because her qualifications allow her to look at so many different things in so many different lights, from a business perspective, from a research, and getting enjoyment out of challenges, but in such a broad spectrum of products and services. Whereas in dentistry, I just feel that that's problematic going into the future. So if I were, as I said, just to recap, if I were any young dentists out there, I would sort of say, great to be a dentist, do as much as you can, enjoy it, et cetera, et cetera. But I would be looking over my shoulder and be saying, okay, what else can I possibly do to just make my life give myself, de-risk my professional life somehow by sort of it's horizontal integration, we would call it in business terms, broadening your product range and broadening your skill set so that you can move into something else, perhaps on a part-time basis where you maybe get a little bit more enjoyment, something that might be totally different, not necessarily in the healthcare profession or dentistry, but just trying to look at something else that may actually pique your interest and give you an opportunity to live the life that you deserve. And I think that if I had the opportunity to talk to all new grads now, and I'm sure the deans of all the faculties would be horrified if I said this, but I certainly, hand on heart, and as I said, the greatest example is show the advice I gave to my daughter would be to, try and upskill and to integrate sort of laterally and give yourself a chance and see where that goes. That's all. Not for everybody. Don't get me wrong. Not for everybody, but I think that's the best bit of advice I could give. And the only other thing is go the Roosters.
I knew that was coming up somewhere. I knew that would come up somewhere in the podcast, and amen to that, mate. Hoping the rugby league season is going to be a good one, even though it's going to be a truncated one. I think it'll still be a great season, mate. And you've got that, well, he's retired now. Cooper Cronk, former Melbourne player, brought 2 premierships to the Roosters with him. He's done all right for you guys.
Yep. Yeah. We had a good run. I don't think I can't really see the three-peat happening, much as I'm I'm rubbing it in my friends' faces, but I don't think it's going to happen. I think we've lost that edge a little bit. I think losing Latrell was was a big one, but look, it's just a pity. I just hope they don't do anything stupid with this infection stuff and not getting immunized. And they do some pretty crazy things. I fear for it. And I see the Americans, opening up a lot of their sports and things. And I just see, I may be wrong, but instead of a V-shaped spike that Trump's talking about, I see this incredibly elongated U-shape recovery. And that scares me because I just think it's going to just make this thing a lot worse than it could have been. But I may be really wrong, but we'll see.
We'll see what happens. David, thank you so much for your time today, mate. You're a scholar and a gentleman, mate, and it's been an enormous thrill and pleasure for me to be able to talk to you today. Thanks, mate.
Thanks, Jess. So all the best for everybody, okay? Thanks a lot.
Cheers,
Look
mate.
after yourself.
You too. Cheers, mate.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to the Savvy Dentist podcast with Dr. Jesse Green. For more free tools and resources, join the free Facebook group. Visit drjessegreen.com/Facebook. And for more episodes, visit drjessegreen.com/savvydentist.